For our gospel reading, we heard Jesus tell us not to worry about what we're going to eat, what we're going to drink, or what we're going to wear. And you know, that's one of the most puzzling statements that Jesus made, I think. What in the world did he mean by that? And that's what I'd like for us to think about today. And I want to do that by leaving this passage and go and look at one of the parables of Jesus. It's the parable of the unforgiving servant. In that parable, there's a man who owes a tremendous amount of money to another man and he cannot pay it back. And the man he owes it to brings him in and demands the money. Who's going to send him over and sell him into slavery. And the guy begs him, says, please don't. He said, I will repay you. He just begged and begged. And so the guy feels sorry for him. He says, okay, I'll just forgive what you owe me. You don't have to pay me back. I'll just forgive it. And the man's so happy he had his debt forgiven, and he goes out, and as he's leaving, he runs into a man that owes him a little tiny bit of money. And he grabs this man and he says, pay me what you owe. And the man says, I can't pay you. And the guy goes and has him thrown into jail. And so the guy that then had forgiven this man all the money he owed him hears about this. And he calls this guy in and he said, I forgave you this huge debt. And here you go out and have someone thrown into prison for just owing you a few pennies. And so this guy has him thrown to the torturers. And he'll be tortured until he pays back every last dime. Now this parable centers around debt. And when you think about it, I don't know if you've noticed this or not, but when you go through the Gospels and look at the things Jesus said, it's interesting that so many of them have to do with debt, owing money. In the Gospel of Mark, Jesus is criticizing the scribes. That was one class of the Jewish leaders. And he criticizes them for devouring widows' houses. And that is a reference to seizing and selling a house when someone dies in debt. A man dies and he has debts and the widow cannot pay, and so they take the house away from his widow to pay her dead husband's debts. In Luke chapter 16 is what is called the parable of the unjust steward. And in this parable there's a man who works for this man over here, and he has embezzled or frazzled away all this guy's money. And he's found out. And he knows he's going to lose his job. And he's thinking to himself, what am I going to do when I lose my job? I'm not able to do manual labor and I'm too proud to beg. And so he comes up with a plan. He calls in all the people who owed his employer money, and he reduces what they owe to just a small amount. And of course all those people are really, really happy, and they're thankful to him for doing that. And you know, the reason he did that was when he lost his job, all these people would be so thankful for him for reducing their debts that they would help him out and take him in, and he'd have somewhere to go when he lost his job. Of course, his employer found out about it. He found out what the guy had done. And you would have expected the employer to call the man in and say, well, how dare you reduce all these debts? But he didn't. He called the man in and he commended him for it because he was so shrewd to think up that kind of plan. Now let's look at another example. In Luke chapter 12, Jesus says, when you go with your adversary to the magistrate, make every effort along the way to settle with him, lest he drag you in front of the judge, and the judge deliver you to the officer, and the officer throws you into prison. Now the reference there is to someone who is suing you because you owe them money and have not paid. The judge may throw you in prison. In Matthew chapter 5, Jesus said, if anyone wants to sue you and take away your tunic, let him have your cloak also. This is a reference again to someone suing you because you have not paid a debt. They want to seize your clothes as payment of the debt. Now, in the Lord's Prayer, it is customary throughout 90% of Christianity to say, "Forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us." But literally, that is, "Forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors." And that word there, in the literal sense, does not have any connotation whatsoever with sin. It is talking about financial debts. You see how much of what Jesus talked about centered around debt. And why was that? Debt was a major problem back in the time in which Jesus lived. Historians tell us that back then it was a two-class society. There was a handful of people on the top that owned everything, and most people were dirt poor. And these people often had to depend on credit just to live. If you think about it, if you're dirt poor and any little thing happens and you have no money, then you have to borrow it. And sometimes that's the only way you can survive. One of the main reasons people got into debt back then was that it was a time of high taxation. The Roman government had tax collectors whose job it was to collect the Roman taxes. And the way that worked was that they were given a certain amount of money that they had to send to the government, but they could collect whatever they wanted to from people. In fact, that's how they made their money. They owed a certain amount of taxes, and then they collected more than that from people, and the difference was their profit. And they often collected way, way, way much more than what people actually owed, and they got rich. And that put a crushing burden on people. People often had to go into debt just to pay their taxes. Government taxes, though, at that time were not the only taxes people had to pay. The religious leaders of Judaism had their own tax. It was called the temple tax. And historians tell us that sometimes this was as much as 50% of a farmer's entire production for the year. They might well have to go into debt in order to be able to pay that temple tax and still live for the rest of the year. And some scholars believe this is the situation Jesus was talking about when he was talking about the scribes devouring widows' houses. Their husbands had not been able to pay the temple tax, and their husbands died. And so the property was seized by the Jewish leaders to pay the debt. Now, this system of debt and taxes led to an economy in which the wealth was concentrated in the hands of a few, and that's where it was going to stay. The system was designed to produce that effect and maintain that. And so that's the way people lived back then. Dirt poor in debt. And back then, if you could not pay your debt, you could be put into prison. In fact, they say that was one of the major functions of the court system back then, was to settle disputes over debt and send people to prison who could not pay. If you were put in prison over a debt, you remained there until you paid it back. But if you were in prison, of course, you're not going to be able to work and make money and pay the debt back. So how could you ever get out? Well, you had to depend on family or friends or somebody else to pay it back for you. People languished in prison, being tortured in horrible conditions for years and years, hoping someone would pay their debt back. It was also a time when you could be sold into slavery in order to repay a debt. Someone you owed money to could have you sold into slavery, and not only you, but also your wife and your children. What if you had to live with that threat over your head? If you got into debt, if we get into debt and can't pay, they just come and repossess your whatever it is you financed, or maybe repossess your house, but you're not going to get thrown into prison, and you're not going to see your wife or your husband and your children sold into slavery. One of the things that made debt such a problem back then was that the money was loaned at very high interest rates. At high interest rates, interest charges really mount up due to the effect of what's called compound interest. That's because you have to pay interest on the interest. Assume, for example, that you borrow $1,000 at 25% interest. And that's not unusual. Many credit cards are that high, and some of them go up to like 35%. That kind of interest rate is not unusual either on these buy here, pay here car loans, where you make weekly payments on a car. People get filthy rich off of that because of this usurious interest rate. So anyway, assume that you borrow $1,000, 25%. The interest is $250 for year number 1. And here you are, you're dirt poor. And at the end of that year, you say, well, I've got $100 I can pay on my loan. Well, you still owe $1,150. At the end of year number 2, you'll owe $1,437. At the end of year number 4, you'll owe $2,200, even if you're making payments every year. You've made payments every year for the past 4 years, but you owe over twice what you borrowed. And after 4 more years, even after making a $100 a month payment, you have paid back 80% of what you owe, but what you borrowed, but you owe 5 times what you borrowed. It will mushroom into over $5,000 in just 8 years. And that is even if you are paying $100 a month. So you can see that with interest, debts can really mount up and mushroom into something you could never hope to pay back. And that was the situation people lived in back then. Once they got into debt, it was a vicious cycle and they couldn't get out. Many people found themselves in that situation. And you know what that led to? You could go to prison, or you could be sold into slavery. And that was the situation many people lived in New Testament times. Now I want us to think of Old Testament times. The ancient Hebrew religion in the book of Deuteronomy contains a prohibition against charging interest on loans. It says you shall not charge interest to your brother, interest on money, food, or anything that is lent out. The books of Exodus and Leviticus also flat out prohibit charging interest on loans. They could not charge interest to fellow Hebrews. Now I want to stop and think about something here. Depending on what Bible translation you use, when you look at these passages, you may see a word called usury. And we want to convince ourselves that what that means is charging a way high interest rate, but that's not the case. The word in the Bible means charging interest at all, any amount. It's not prohibiting charging a high rate of interest. It is flat out prohibiting charging interest at all. And so the Hebrews were forbidden to charge interest to each other. They were allowed, though, to charge it to foreigners, but even that was frowned upon. The book of Psalms in chapter 15 talks about the righteous. We used that psalm today. He who does not put his money at usury, or does not lend his money at interest. Remember, usury in the Bible does not mean charging a high interest. It means charging interest at all. Chapter 18 of the book of Ezekiel talks about the just man. And one of the characteristics it lists of the just man is that he has not received increase or interest. That is, he has not charged interest on loans. And so in the earlier part of the New Testament, we see that charging interest on loans is flat out prohibited among the Hebrews. In the latter part of the Old Testament, we see that it seems to be condemned, period, no matter who it is. Why in the world would the Old Testament condemn charging interest? Well, think back to what we saw from New Testament times, how people were getting hopelessly head over heels in debt because of interest. And that was the situation the prohibition against charging interest in the Old Testament was trying to avoid. There was debt among people in the Old Testament, but there was no interest charge and that made debts more manageable. But even relative to debt, we see something interesting. Every 7th year, there was to be a Sabbath year in which all debts were canceled. And so if you were in debt, and during that Sabbath year you hadn't been able to pay it all back, it was all canceled out, and you didn't owe it anymore. That was another way the Hebrews had that protected them from becoming hopelessly mired in debt. But of course, people find a way around things. In the latter part of the New Testament, we see how they developed a trick called a cross bull. And that was a legal maneuver whereby the creditor would transfer his, if you owed somebody money, they would transfer that loan over to the court for that Sabbath year, and then they'd get it back the next year, and then that's how they got around having the debt canceled out. By the time of Jesus, though, the prohibition against lending interest was basically ignored. Make no mistake about it, the Old Testament, from the early part through the latter part, clearly prohibits lending money and interest. It really does. So now let's go back to what we talked about at the beginning. Jesus telling us not to worry about what we're going to eat or what we're going to wear. In order to understand what Jesus was trying to say, we have to hear that the way people back then would have heard it. The images and thoughts that would have been created in their minds, living in the situation they lived, in the society they lived, are the images that express what Jesus was trying to say. We cannot think about that using the images that pop into our minds and our situation today, because they're completely different than those people lived in back then. In order to understand what Jesus was saying, we have to hear it the way those people back then would have heard it. So let's think about these people. They're dirt poor. They live in a society that keeps them in constant debt. And they live in fear that if they cannot pay that debt back, they'll either be in prison where they'll be tortured, or them and their family will be sold into slavery. There was no safety net in their society. No soup kitchens, no homeless shelters, no food stamps, no unemployment benefits, no Social Security, no Medicare. And being so poor and having no safety net, they were never sure a lot of times where their food was going to come from for the very next week. It was to people like this to whom Jesus said, do not worry about what you will eat, about what you will drink, about what you will wear. If you lived under the circumstances those people lived under, how would you react to what Jesus said? It'd be hard to even imagine, wouldn't it? Because that's so far from the situation that we live under, we can't really even imagine what they would have reacted with. When I was working on this, though, I thought about back last spring. It wasn't quite this early, it was maybe in April, back when they were really ramping up the coronavirus stuff, and they started talking about coming food shortages. Y'all remember that? It's hard to believe, when you go back some of the things they said back then, but they said there are going to be so many people sick with the coronavirus that the food supply is going to be disrupted. The employees of meat packing plants and canneries are all going to be out sick, and we won't have any food. Now, that's when people engaged in panic buying at the grocery store. And I remember going to the grocery store back then, and then being out of so many things. And I'd come home and I'd tell Wanda what I was able to get that week. Well, I was able to get this, I was able to get this. I mean, we looked for consomme soup, and I about panicked when somebody told me, and I never did figure out this was true, that the Duke's mayonnaise plant had shut down, and I thought I could do without anything except Duke's mayonnaise. But we never did run out of Duke's mayonnaise. Now, while we never actually ran out of food, there was a time where I did get somewhat concerned about it. And I remember we were looking for something we couldn't find, and we were in Kings Mountain one day, and I went in the food line to see if they had it. And that was the worst grocery store I'd ever been in as far as empty shelves. The place looked like it was closing. And I just about panicked when I was in there. And another time I remember us stopping at store after store trying to find a loaf of bread. Now, who would have ever thought that we would have gone to multiple stores finding one little loaf of bread? So we made up our minds that we'd be ready for the next time. So now we have a large stockpile, not only of food, but also of all kinds of basic essential items that we regularly rotate. There is sometimes an advantage to having a bunch of buildings outside. And so if they try to pull something like that again, we're ready for them. But you know, what if we hadn't been able to do that? What if we really had not found the food? What if the grocery stores had gone? What if we were not able to have that cushioned food that we've got stored up? You know, it's one thing to hear Jesus say not to worry about what you'll eat when you have a pantry full of food, when you've got money in the bank, and when the grocery store shelves are all stocked. Under those conditions, Jesus saying, don't worry about what you'll eat, sounds one way. But under the condition of not really knowing what you're going to eat next week, Jesus saying, don't worry about what you will eat, takes on a completely different meaning. I want to look at something else Jesus said. This is what's called the parable of the rich fool. In that parable, Jesus told of a farmer who had bumper crops. He had so much crops that year, had to build new barns to store it in. When he got it all harvested and all packed away, he said, I've got enough to last me for many years. I can enjoy life, eat, drink, and be merry. And so you just think about that. We, in our situation, hear that one way. But what if you were in the position of the people back then? Hopelessly admired in debt. Did not know whether you'd be able to pay it back. Did not know whether you'd have food next week or not. Had nothing. You were in dire poverty. And you hear Jesus tell that. I don't know if I were in that situation, maybe I would have thought, oh gosh, how good it would be to have all that stuff stored back. To be out of debt, not have to worry about how I was going to pay that money back. Not have to worry about where my food was going to come from next week. I might have stood there and thought that. And then I would have heard Jesus say that that man was a fool. So how would I have thought when I heard Jesus say that man was a fool? You see, that's what we really need to consider. We have to try to put ourselves in the position of those people back then and try to hear it like they would hear it. After all, you know, Jesus was directing this stuff to them. He was directing it to a certain group of people in a certain situation. Is there any way we can do that, though? Most everything Jesus said in the Gospels was directed at people who live under a crushing economic system designed to keep them pushed down at the bottom and in desperate poverty. And yet he told them not to store stuff up. He told them not to worry about what they would eat or what they would drink or what they would wear. I realize I have not told you how to interpret what Jesus meant when he said not to worry about what you will eat, what you will drink, or what you will wear. But I hope I have given you a framework to use to think about it. Because you see, when we hear those things in our situation today, it sort of has that sweet little daily devotional type sound to it. But if we were living in abject poverty, head over heels in debt, just one missed payment away from being thrown into the prison and being tortured, or just one missed payment away from having our family, seeing our children thrown into slavery, if we did not know where we would get food for our children for the next week. If we were in that situation, hearing this stuff would sound completely different. And so that's really what I want you to keep in mind. And that was the point of the whole thing. We have to hear it with their ears. Hear it in their shoes in order to really be able to understand what Jesus is trying to say.